Tony is playing intently with her friends at Walsingham School Nursery near Durham. She doesn't know it, but by socializing in this way, she's accelerating her development of knowledge and understanding. At least that's the claim of many psychologists. But are the effects clear and significant enough to warrant the expenditure of huge government funds on widespread provision of preschool education? And how do we find out? How can we unravel cause and effect from what seems like a chaotic world of children's play? This program looks at two of the main methods of research used to tackle questions like this: observation and experimentation. So where do we start? We could just watch children playing in nurseries and try to work out what's happening as they interact with each other. Many of the studies generated by debates on nursery education in the last 2 decades have been based on observational methods. One of the leading researchers has been Cathy Silver.
We were very interested in children's play in ordinary nursery schools, ordinary playgroups. So we, instead of doing an experiment, we decided to go out into the schools, the nurseries, see how children were playing, what objects they were using to play with, how they played with one another.
After studying 125 individual children, Cathy Silver and her team began to notice patterns of behavior. They devised a system of categorizing the way children played into 2 types, ordinary and complex, to help them record their observations. Ordinary or simple play was defined as being familiar, routine, repetitive, or unproductive. Complex play appeared to be more original, imaginative, and productive.
I'll give an example so you can see how we actually coded and decided what was complex play. Imagine a child making an object. So we look at the child, we look at the object, and we see, is it progressively getting more complicated? We see whether the child is concentrating very hard. And then we look at the end object. Does it have several different parts? Is it really, can we tell what this object is? And if we say the child has slowly developed this creation, that he had to plan, he had to decide what part would have to come on first, which part second, then we have the evidence, both from the product, what he's made, but also from the way he's actually made it.
The team also noticed that the patterns of play appeared to change according to whether the child was playing alone or with others. Could it be that the opportunity for children to play with others, which nurseries provide, increases the complexity of play? Is this the missing link in explaining the effects of preschool experience on development? First, we have to find out whether the 2 variables are indeed linked. This can only be done by using highly systematic procedures. But with so many things going on at any one time, a major problem is how to reduce our observations to manageable proportions without losing the crucial details. One way is to devise a system of coding the data.
When we want to look at the play of 120 children or 200 children, we have to have some way that enables us to compare across these children, to contrast, to look for associations. So by coding the data, we can turn each child's record into a kind of skeleton of what that child was doing, and all the little detail falls out.
But the system is not as easy as it seems. The collection of data is rarely straightforward. Some instances of play are clearly repetitive and therefore ordinary. Others are more inventive and therefore complex. But some are ambiguous, and this is all part of the challenge.
He's going here. He's going down the and down the center.
I think it's quite easy to decide that a child is playing in a peer relationship with one other child. The hardest bit of coding in target child is, was it complex or was it ordinary? So it isn't easy, but people who persevere, who have lots of training, who talk to one another, bring examples back from their pilot work. In the end, we finally achieved a manual with lots of descriptions how to make the judgment.
An important way of reducing ambiguity and improving the reliability of observations is to have 2 or more observers coding the data, say, every 30 seconds.
But towards the end, I thought that that was ordinary, because while she was pushing the vehicle around, all she was doing was just watching the other. She was pushing it, but she was watching the others, so she wasn't really doing anything complex.
Because she was fighting.
Even in this simplified version of coding, there are disagreements. But these can be identified and further criteria agreed to reduce ambiguity in the future. Researchers would normally aim for at least 80 to 90% agreement across the coding periods. Another problem is that the presence of researchers might itself alter the children's behavior and distort the information gathered. Trying to avoid this can sometimes lead to difficult situations.
I think one of the most difficult jobs of the observer is to be as unobtrusive as possible, to be a fly on the wall, and just to be recording the child but not interacting. And in my early observing, I made an awful mistake there. I was so interested to be a neutral observer, just writing down. I followed a child while taking record all the time, who went into the loo, looked at me a little bit. I was a scientist taking record, sat down on the floor. I was writing, child sits on floor. Then he took off his shoe, child takes off shoe. Then he took off his sock, child takes off sock. I was so keen to be a neutral observer. He then flushed the sock away, all for my benefit, and I was never allowed in that nursery again.
In spite of local difficulties like that, Professor Silver found correlations between the type of play and whether children were playing alone or with others. She showed that for children between the ages of 4.5 and 5.5, playing alone involves ordinary play for 74% of the time and complex for 26% of the time. But when children play in pairs, they spend twice as much time in complex play as when they're alone. Already then, our observational methods are suggesting a theory about why preschool experience is beneficial. It appears that social interaction encourages complex play, which it's fair to assume implies more complex thinking and increased mental development. Does this then settle the arguments? Is it suitable meat for politicians and social scientists, and a mandate for parents and teachers? Does it mean that inducing children to interact in pairs is the way to accelerate cognitive development? Professor Peter Bryant has used both observational and experimental methods.
Yes, I think it's dangerous to draw practical conclusions about how to bring up children, how to educate children, just on the basis of observational studies. Because the observational studies on their own won't tell you what is causing changes in children's behavior. It may be, when you find 2 factors associated with each other, that neither causes the other, that both are determined by some other third factor which you don't know about, and therefore haven't measured.
So there are risks in basing practical decisions on this sort of research alone. This is why we need experimental methods as well.
Observational and experimental studies produce different sorts of information.